Good morning. Well, we find ourselves 1 month into 2025. Christmas was like yesterday, but here we are. It is for us at Evergreen the year of warfare mindset. But I want to talk about that just for a moment. A number of conversations that I've had over the last couple of weeks, I think I want to maybe better define what a warfare mindset is. We don't see it in its full importance if by warfare mindset we mean that we are just sort of vaguely aware that there's a war going on. Warfare mindset is not simply the awareness of war. A warfare mindset is an understanding of how I contribute to victory in that battle. A warfare mindset is a mindset that says I want to live a purposeful life so that I am useful in the battle. I don't think there's any one of us that would sort of casually affirm that, yeah, there's a spiritual battle going on in our culture. We see the ramifications of that conflict in lots of different ways. But I think by and large, we still live in a generation, at least in America, a generation of churches led by pastors and filled with members who sort of see themselves as detached from the battle. It's sort of a battle that's, out there and we know about it, but that's different than understanding what my role is. And everybody has different roles, but there is something about having an understanding that we've been redeemed and then gifted and then charged to take our redemption and our gifts and engage the battle. As a historian, I love to play those, what-if games where you contemplate different possibilities in history or different kinds of questions. And I was thinking about it this week, and the question came to my mind, what was the most dangerous moment of World War II? If we could survey this room and everybody could have answers, what was the most dangerous moment of World War II? Somebody might say, well, it's obviously D-Day. I mean, that all-out invasion of Europe that really was sort of a make-or-break moment for the Allied cause against the Nazis. Maybe it was D-Day. Somebody else might say, well, no, it was Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was such a devastating defeat, and it was really the most dangerous moment of World War II because we realized at that moment that we were in a war, but we were woefully underprepared for it. We didn't have the means to produce ships and planes and all of the things necessary for warfare. So maybe it was that moment when we were least prepared for the battle that was coming. Maybe it was the moments before the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. Maybe it was that moment of uncertainty about what the right decision strategically moving forward. Do we do this? Do we do that? Do we fight a hand-to-hand battle across the islands of the Pacific, or do we drop this unprecedented weapon? Maybe that was the most dangerous moment of World War II. I've thought about it some, and I tell you my answer, and it might surprise you. I think the most dangerous moment of World War II was the moment that Harry S. Truman was inaugurated as president. You say, well, you don't like Harry Truman? No, Harry Truman's fine. I don't have anything against Harry Truman. But when you go back and read the history of those days, after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman from Missouri was inaugurated president. But we find out, looking back, that at that moment, with the United States in a world war that had been raging for 4 years of our participation, 6 years or longer for other nations, in that moment, we discover that Harry Truman had no knowledge of the Manhattan Project. He didn't know anything about the project that would develop the atomic bomb. He had no knowledge of Japanese plans in the Pacific. He had no contact with the military intelligence that we had gathered that helped us know how to make decisions because we had some leg up on what Japan was planning to do. Harry S. Truman, at his inauguration, had no knowledge of the Potsdam Conference, that place where Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin had come together to put together a strategy for the plans in post-war Europe. Truman wasn't privileged to have any of that information. He didn't know how we had agreed to deal with post-war Germany. He didn't know our military resources. He didn't know the strategic planning of the generals and the chiefs of staff as we planned the war. He just didn't know. The most dangerous moment of World War II was when America found itself in the battle for its life with a leader who had no idea about anything important to the battle. I think that there are churches led by pastors who, for whatever reason, have no understanding of the battle that we are engaged in. In fact, if they understood it, they would be more willing to be involved in it. But instead, they've taken the path of least resistance. They've tried to say nice words that keep everybody pacified. We have churches filled with people in pews who don't understand what spiritual warfare is. They think that really cultural warfare is what this is all about, that it's the flesh and blood issues of people who think differently than us, people who have different values than us. They think that's the battle. It's a dangerous moment in a war when an army has no idea who they're fighting, what their resources are, what their strategy is, what the plans of the enemy are, when they have no understanding. We've been in a series of messages this month about spiritual warfare, and really up until this moment, we've talked a lot about the preliminaries, the preparations, the things that have to sort of be established and put into place in order for us to become an unassailable army. But it's time for us to move into a discussion of the warfare itself. And so today we're going to be in the 6th chapter of the New Testament book of Ephesians. Now, I want to talk to you about this chapter a little bit, because one of the things that makes people so misunderstand the Bible is this little word called context. We have a tremendous tendency as American Christians to sort of carve out verses or little paragraphs of the Bible and hold them up like they're a magic bullet or some sort of magical incantation. If we just say the right words, then certain things happen. When in fact, context is the way we properly understand what the Spirit was saying through whatever the writer is that he was utilizing at that moment. In the 6th chapter of Ephesians, we have what is often referred to as the spiritual warfare chapter of the New Testament. It's true that beginning in chapter 6, verse 10, and running through the end of the chapter, we have maybe the classic explanation of the elements of battle that we need to understand as followers of Jesus Christ. But it's not an accident that this discussion of spiritual warfare is placed exactly in the book of Ephesians where it's placed. If you look at the context, what we see is that in chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Ephesians, you have what's called the application part of the book. The first 3 chapters are theology. Paul talks about salvation, and he paints this grand picture of the truths of the gospel. He talks in chapter 1 about how we've been adopted into the family, and it's incredible theology. It's a mountaintop peak of theology. But then in chapters 4, 5, and 6, Paul comes down off that mountaintop with all that wonderful theology, and he says, let's talk about now how we play this out in real life, in our everyday world. And so that's what he does. And in these chapters, he talks to us about how we live the Christian life in the context of real places. He talks about marriage and how husband and wives live the Christian life in relationship with each other. Man, you want a recipe for disaster in your marriage? Take 2 Christians who don't understand how their Christianity is the undergirding reality of their marriage. He wants us to live the Christian life. He wants us to chase Jesus in the context of that relationship with our spouse. Then he talks about our relationship to our children, how children relate to their parents, how parents relate to their children. And he does it in the way of saying our Christianity has this ripple effect that impacts the atmosphere that is our family life. And then he talks about slaves and masters, or we would put it in the context of employees and bosses. And he says, here's how you take the reality of this mountaintop theology that you've been adopted into the family, and you take that reality and you live it out in the real world context of where you go to work, in the midst of that sphere of influence, the people that you touch by your presence in that place. And it's only then, after he's had these very practical applications of the Christian life, but then he comes along in chapter 6, verse 10, and he says, and finally. Finally is one of those words kind of like therefore. It means you go back and you see what it's connected to. Paul didn't start a new chapter. He didn't start a new topic. He didn't have a hard break where everything before this was about the practical day-to-day Christian life. And now we're going to have this esoteric, kind of bizarre conversation about invisible realities and warfare. No, it flows right out of one into the other. It's clear that Paul's implication for us was that we are to understand that spiritual warfare is a common, everyday element of the normal Christian life. It is not reserved for professional pastors and paid staff members. It's not reserved for those people who just want to go the second mile, those really kind of super Christians that you look to and you go, man, I'll never be like that. No, this is information designed for every single person who follows Jesus Christ, and this is to be our normal experience. You ever thought about this? Living the Christian life in our generation is a lot like camping out in enemy territory. You see, when you got saved, when Christ met you, when he found you, when you were adopted into the family, he said, I'm going to give you a spiritual gift. I'm going to supernaturally prepare you. And then I'm going to leave you here. Wait, what? No, I'm drawn to Christ. I want to be around the throne. I want to go to heaven. You will. You will, but for right now, I'm going to leave you right here. Why? Enemy territory. I know enemy territory. Why are you leaving me here? Because there's a war going on. Well, yeah, I've read the papers. I know there's a war going on. Yeah, but see, I've prepared you now. And you're a part of my army, and you're fighting the war. We got to quit having this attitude of just sort of keeping my head down and staying out of the crossfire and just not engaging. You know, I don't want to, one of Satan's most effective tools in the last generation of American life is this absolutely bizarre fear of offending anybody. I can't talk about these things because somebody will be offended. And then what will happen? I don't know. They'll be upset. And then what will happen? Well, they might be mad at me. And then what will happen? I mean, we treat this sensitivity to offense in our culture like the sky falls in. We're adults. It's okay to be offended. The world's not going to come crashing down if somebody doesn't like what you say. The only way you fail in the task of fighting this battle is if you refuse to fight. People make jokes about Jesus. They take Jesus' name in vain at the workplace. Do you just sort of look the other way and try and keep your head down? Or do you say, hey, wait, dude, that's not okay. This is the king of the universe. Played golf with a guy one time who didn't find out I was a pastor till the 15th hole. He'd been cussing like a blue streak for the whole time. I thought at one point, if you're this bad a golfer, why don't you just give it up? It's good for your religion. He found out I was a pastor, and he just immediately almost swallowed his tongue. He's like, oh, listen, I'm so sorry, Pastor. I said, no, you're not. He goes, well, I really do respect God. I said, no, you don't. Well, I apologize to you. Okay, that's fine. I'm not the one you need to apologize to. Now, I didn't make a big deal. I didn't punch him in the nose. But I also didn't go, oh, it's all right, because it wasn't all right. There's a spiritual warfare going on, and people like him, it's not that he's in league with the devil on purpose. He's a prisoner of war who just happens to have swallowed the propaganda. I had to take pity on him. But even that conversation is an aspect of spiritual warfare. We've all read, those old Peretti books and other Christian novels, and there's angels and demons flying around everywhere. And we think, well, that's fiction. And then we come and we don't realize that to some degree, there is an invisible realm, and that's exactly what's happening. Before we start talking about angels and demons, you need to check yourself, because it's the tendency of American Christians to go, well, all of that stuff, that's just an ancient way to communicate. It's just their understanding because they didn't really have a scientific mindset and blah, blah, blah. Listen, you better be really careful about thinking yourself smarter than the Apostle Paul and Jesus Christ himself, because they believed in angels and demons. And if we start sort of poo-pooing the whole idea because, the intelligent people don't think that way. That's why intelligent people are often so spiritually stupid. Because they have convinced themselves that if it doesn't make sense to them, it's not real. When the fact of the matter is, angels are real. Demons are real. Spiritual conflict in the heavenly places is real. And we better figure out what our part is in this process, or we're going to be useless to the kingdom. Ephesians chapter 6, in the context of this normal application in all of these aspects of our life, Paul says this, beginning in verse 10, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Let's talk about this. This business of spiritual warfare, we've gone through the preliminaries. We've made up our minds about which side we stand on. We have repented and asked Christ to wash us and make us clean and useful for the battle. We've gotten ready for the fight, but now Paul says, here we go. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. You have to know your spiritual resources. The believer is told to be strong. Now, I know you're not interested in a grammar lesson, but let me just give you this much Greek grammar from this verse. Be strong, or more literally, it can be translated be made powerful. It is a passive tense verb. What that means is, this is not a verb of action. It's not something that you do. It's a passive verb, which means it is something done to you. A person cannot strengthen himself. He must be empowered by someone else. Now, Paul says, be made strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. The source is in the Lord. That's how you're made strong. The qualification this qualification dispenses with the possibility that any of us have adequate human resources on our own to be spiritually effective in this generation. You see, the reality here is Paul wants us to understand Christians are never intended to be weak. Now, we are weak because we know that we can't do this Christian life without the presence of the Spirit of God in us. That's a fundamental understanding that we can't be self-sufficient. We can't do it all on our own. But what Paul is talking about here is this idea, not a proper humility that understands I can't do anything without Christ, but a kind of debilitating humility that says, oh, shucks, I can't make a contribution. There's nothing that I can offer. I'm not good enough. You know, somebody else needs to do this. There's others who are so much better than me. Listen, your problem is not that you're not gifted enough. Your problem is not that you're not smart enough. Your problem is not that you're not faithful enough. Your problem is you haven't allowed yourself to be made powerful in the Lord. There is a time in our private closets, those prayer places that we go to, where we have to come and say, Lord, before I get up from this place, before I go out, before I go to my job, before I go see people, I'm going to be in the midst of a world where the enemy is at work all the time, and I'm not up for this challenge unless you empower me to live my day. We got to quit praying that God will help us when the storm hits and start recognizing that we need God to help us every time we walk out our door. I need to be made strong in the Lord. It's got to be a part of my everyday process. That's my resource, His mighty power. Christians are never intended to be weak, but they have to take steps in order to be strong. We think, well, I attend church. I sit next to some pretty godly people. You know, just sort of by osmosis, that might rub off. I go to men's prayer breakfast, and sometimes I sit at a table with some guys that are real prayer warriors. Awesome. Sit next to godly people in church. Sit next to prayer warriors at men's prayer breakfast. But you know what? At some point, you got to take the steps to be made strong, to become a prayer warrior yourself. Quit leaving the responsibility for doing battle in prayer in the hands of other people. You know, they weren't always prayer warriors. They started somewhere by saying, God, teach me how to pray. That person sitting next to you that you have so much respect for their Christian life, they weren't just born that way. They walked with Jesus and they became strong. They were made strong in Christ. That's what you got to do. Lord, I don't want to be weak. I don't want to be on the sidelines. I don't want to be the last one picked to play the game. I want you to make me strong. I want to take the steps necessary. I want to memorize Scripture. I want to put your word in my mind. I want to hide it in my heart. I want to learn the discipline of prayer. I want to take the steps to be made strong. Because I recognize one thing, that the strength that I need is not my own. I need it to come from you. Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. But look at this. If we're supposed to prepare properly, if we're supposed to be made strong, we're all supposed to dress appropriately. He says in verse 11, put on the full armor of God. Now, we're going to talk about that next week because the rest of this chapter, Paul is going to come back and he's going to begin to outline the armor of God. But in my sanctified imagination, I see Paul in a jail cell. And outside that jail cell, there's a Roman centurion guarding him. And as Paul is writing these words under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, I see him looking that soldier up and down, and in his mind, he's examining every part of the armor. And the Spirit is just showing him the spiritual application and how each part of the armor, everything that was designed to make a Roman centurion strong, really has application in the spiritual realm. Paul may have even known about this saying. There was a Roman writer before the generation of Paul by the name of Polybius. Polybius, talking about Roman soldiers, said, a Roman centurion has to be the kind of man who can be relied upon to stand fast and not give way. See, the Roman Empire After the period of Alexander the Great, when that empire broke up, Rome comes onto the scene. They were the greatest superpower for 400 years. But what made the Roman army so devastating was not just their tactics, but their creed, their commitment that a Roman army, once it has taken ground, it never gives up that ground. The Roman army had, as a part of its training, it drilled into their soldiers the idea that you never retreat. In fact, next week when we finish this chapter and we look at the armor, you're going to realize that as Paul is describing this armor, he's looking at this Roman soldier and it dawns on him, this guy has nothing to protect his back. That's because the Roman soldier, everything about him was designed to advance, to move forward. And once he took ground, he dug his feet in, he stood firm. The only way you were taking that ground was to kill that soldier. And as soon as you killed him, another soldier would claim that ground and take that spot. We have to have that kind of mindset. It is this business of advancing in the faith and moving forward with the understanding that there's no provision made for retreat. It kills me to watch the church in America. At times, it seems like in full-fledged retreat. They're running for the hills. Why? Because somebody might not like us. Because the media is mean to us. Because politicians hate us. Well, guess what? Politicians hated Jesus too. The media didn't report well on that story. Why would we expect them to like us? We have to have this mindset that we're in a battle and we advance and we never give up ground that we have taken. There's no part of our creed that makes it okay to fall back. Now, in this battle, we have to understand who our enemy is. We have to stand firm. He says, put on the armor of God. We'll talk about that more next week, so that you're able to stand firm. That was the typical pattern of a Roman soldier. We're to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. Now, we'll talk about that some more next week, but the schemes of the devil are basically a recognition that he seldom attacks us with an all-out frontal assault. He is a guerrilla warfare fighter, which means he uses deception, he uses trickery. He tries to get us to lose little battles, and what makes him so effective is he often puts us in little battles that we lose without recognizing we've even been in a battle. Think about it in these terms. If this battle is, and he tells us in this verse, our battle, we have to know our enemy. He first tells us what our battle is not. Our battle is not against flesh and blood. In other words, the people that we have contact with in day-to-day life, they're not the real enemy. You have to know who the enemy is. Now, there are a few people around who have so sold out to the enemy that they have, in effect, become his human representatives, okay? That's why we throw out the worst names in human history, and we always point to them. There are people that have sold out to the devil. But the vast majority of the world, they are prisoners of war. And if we are content to fight flesh and blood, if we leave our faith at the level of culture wars, we'll never get to the actual enemy, which is the somebody behind those lesser irritations. Let me let you think about it this way. When you get in your car and you're driving to work and somebody cuts you off, I mean, you have to slam on the brakes. They almost hit you. You go to work with a great story about how this guy almost ran me off the road. And just imagine, in your unsanctified imagination, imagine in that moment, imagine what you're saying out loud in your car. You're driving all by yourself, nobody's there, but you're giving that guy an earful. I mean, you're telling him what you think of him. You're using a few choice names that you'd like to apply to him. But do you realize that moment, that's a guerrilla warfare attack, and you've just been brought into spiritual conflict and you lost because you only saw the guy in flesh and blood that was driving that car? You see what the response is supposed to be in that moment? Is, no. Satan's not getting me on this one. God, thank you that you kept me safe. You see, spiritual warfare, because it's not against flesh and blood, that means that we have to have eyes of faith that see invisible realities. It's the invisible realities that we see that allow us to make sense of the physical circumstances that are obvious to us. But most of us operate at the level of the physical without the eyes of faith, so we never make the connection that what just happened to us has a spiritual warfare component to it. Your spouse does something that just grates on you. I mean, I don't know. He just, he's snoring again. And just like, I would smother him with a pillow, but I don't look good in stripes. Do you know, even in those moments, there's a spiritual component to those moments in time. That's not a big battle. We don't typically look at marital conflict and say, that's some spiritual battle in the universe. No, it's just us. We're just fussing with each other. Yeah, you know who celebrates you fussing with each other? Remember how Paul said there's a way to live the Christian life in the context of a husband and wife and finally be strong in the Lord, be made strong in the Lord? Why did he attach marital life and spiritual warfare? Because marital life is one of the favorite places that the enemy attacks in spiritual warfare. We have to have spiritual eyes to see invisible realities. You remember that episode in the life of Elisha? The Old Testament, 2 Kings, Elisha is there, and an army has come to arrest him, and they have surrounded him, and his assistant is losing his mind. I mean, there's an army there. There are soldiers. They're waiting to arrest us. And Elisha's like, it's fine. No. Have you looked out the window? I mean, they've got us surrounded. They've come, and they're coming for us. It's fine, I said. It's not fine, Elisha. Look out the window. And Elisha prays, Lord, please, let this fool see what you've allowed me to see. And the next time he goes and looks out the window, what does he see? All of a sudden, the army that was there fades into insignificance because there is an angelic army surrounding them. Folks, listen. Every conflict, every irritation, every little something that happens in life, if we have spiritual eyes, we can see that every time we have those little things that happen, it's an opportunity for the devil to throw us off of our game, or it's an opportunity for us to win a battle by giving God glory in the way we respond. Spiritual warfare is not what you do on Sunday morning. Spiritual warfare is not something you do on a mission trip. Spiritual warfare is the normal, everyday experience of believers and followers of Jesus Christ. But you got to have eyes to see invisible realities. Now, what are those invisible realities? Well, look at what he says here. Verse 12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Okay, well then who's it against? It's against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Now, I suspect that As I read that verse, you went, yeah, I got nothing. I don't know what that means. Rulers, powers, world forces of darkness, spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. I don't understand. Okay, let's talk about how we recognize our enemy. First of all, we know that they're not flesh and blood. They are spiritual powers. Those spiritual powers include the schemes of the devil, that is his guile, his deception, and spiritual forces of wickedness, that is the occasional encounter of intimidation or brute strength. But let me talk to you about these words, because the Greek meaning of these words help us understand what Paul is saying here that loses something when we translate into English. He says, first of all, that flesh and blood is not the target of our warfare, but we are in battle against the rulers. The word rulers here is a word that implies senior leadership with delegated authority and power. It is a word that would have fit into a military setting as a general, for example, who answers to the commander-in-chief. A general who is empowered to make decisions, strategic decisions, and movements of attack as he goes about the assigned field of battle that has been given to him. Here, with spiritual application, this senior leader with delegated authority and power can be viewed as fallen angels of some significant stature. In other words, we know, biblically speaking, that Satan is a rebel. He challenged the authority of God. He was evicted from heaven, and he was so persuasive in his beauty and his inspiration that a third of the angels of heaven followed him. Okay, that sets the battle lines of this invisible battle that has been going on. Satan with a third of the angels. At some level of that angelic army, which is now a demonic army, there are rulers, high-ranking demons with delegated authority from their commander-in-chief. Secondly, he says we fight against the powers. This is often translated, he says we fight against the powers, but this is often translated we fight against the authorities. It's a Greek word that means essentially middle management. If we continue this military idea, it's as if the rulers are generals under a commanding officer, under a commander-in-chief. The authorities or the powers would be colonels, majors, and captains. They're middle management. They are lords over those that have been placed under their leadership. They act in Satan's name, but they have some sort of middle management standing. The verse then goes on to say we battle against the world forces of this darkness, the powers of this dark world. This is where we find a very practical expression of this army, and that is in those pagan gods and territorial spirits that we often read about in the Bible. I just taught a winter Bible study from the book of Joshua this week. On Wednesday nights, I've been teaching through the book of Judges. If you read Joshua and Judges, what you find is that Israel is faced with evicting tribal peoples who have taken up residence in the Promised Land, and they all have loyalties to their own gods. They serve gods named Baal or Asherah or Molech. In the ancient world, as well as in present-day world, other gods, false gods, they're not just human inventions. It's not that we just don't want to worship the true God, so we invent something else. These are real spiritual beings who have powers that make them attractive to seek out worship. False gods are in this category. This is the level of organization in spiritual warfare, the powers of this darkness. These are the enemies that actually are placed in positions to influence cultures and nations. And then he says the spiritual forces of wickedness. This includes all of Satan's followers remaining, evil spirits operating in the invisible and non-material realm. Now, Paul gives us that information. And you say, well, this is fascinating. Let me talk to you about that response. You may not be aware of the fact, but Old Testament and New Testament combined, the Bible has a tremendous amount of information that it gives us about Satan. In fact, there's so much information in the Bible about Satan that I have actually, over the years, contemplated a teaching series about Satan so that we could sort of survey what the Bible teaches. And the reason I haven't done that is because I never have felt like I've had permission from the Spirit of God to teach a series where Satan takes front and center and stands on this stage for our examination. The Bible gives us what we need to know, but it is dangerous to be overly fascinated with the forces of evil. So Paul says, our battle is against the rulers, it's against the authorities, it's against the spiritual forces of wickedness, spiritual forces of darkness, it's against the powerful forces of wickedness. He gives us a basic 4-level breakdown of who our enemy is. And he doesn't give us more because honestly, we don't need more. And be careful about saying, I'm going to go see what I can find out because I'm fascinated by all this. Don't be fascinated. Satan loves that. He loves one of two. There are two errors, and he's okay with either one of them. Either you're so smart that you tell yourself that you don't believe in angels and demons. He loves those people because they don't even see the attack coming. Or he loves the people that go, man, this is fascinating. I want to know everything I can know about angels and demons. Guess what? Angels and demons, every time angels show up in the Bible and somebody falls down to worship, you know what an angel says? He says, no, don't do that. I worship the same God you do. Don't worship me. See, that's how you know. An angel refuses worship. A demon craves worship. And when we're overly fascinated, if we study angels and we're just captivated by angels, the first thing they would say is, listen, take your eyes off of me and go find out about Jesus. But the demons will say, hey, you want a one-on-one interview? What do you want to know? You know, if you'll be fascinated with me, they love that. Listen, don't spend your time with angels and demons. We are given just enough information to understand that there is an invisible realm with invisible beings fighting invisible battles, and we're mysteriously a part of that. But that is not where the focus of our mind goes. We fix our eyes on Jesus because he's the author and the finisher of our faith. These battles, the last part of verse 12, it's easy to miss this. These enemies operate in the heavenly places. That is simply a description that Paul gives us to describe the invisible realm. We are living in a flesh and blood realm, but we are instructed to live in the flesh and blood realm with eyes that see invisible realities. The church in America will never be strong again until we recapture eyes that see the invisible realm. We're still stuck in flesh and blood battles. When we come back to this passage, he's going to take us on a tour of our armor, the weapons of our warfare. But it's important that he gave us these verses first, because to dress ourselves up in our armor and to take our weapons of warfare is dramatically premature if we don't even know where the battle is. Here's what I'm going to ask of you today. I'm going to ask that you would find time this week to pray for yourself, that you would be made strong in the power of His might. And then I'm going to ask that you, in an unusual way, maybe you do this already, but I want to ask you in really an unusual way, if you would spend focused time praying for your pastors. See, I want you to understand my heart. I am not afraid. I am not afraid of what's coming. But I have done this long enough to understand that when I teach on spiritual warfare, when God moves among His people, as He is doing right now among a people called Evergreen, the baptisms, the people coming to Christ, the people discovering a new passion for their faith, there are extraordinary things happening here. When the enemy, the master of the other army, when he sees God at work here, what's the military thing to do? You call up reinforcements for that battlefield. I am not afraid of what's coming, but I understand what's coming. And that is when a church takes seriously the issue of spiritual warfare, when a church refuses to sleepwalk through its days as though the invisible realm doesn't exist, that brings attack. It brings the temptation for conflict. It brings minor irritations designed to simply distract us and throw us off of our game. What's at stake here is the unity that God has given this church, which is a supernatural gift. We don't create unity, God gives unity, but we are charged biblically to protect and preserve the unity. God has done a remarkable thing here. This is a church essentially without conflict. But I tell you, the enemy has no new strategies. He's not creative. He doesn't come up with new stuff. He does what he always does. And his strategy will be within your pastors, within our church family. He will do his best to create irritations that become distractions, that make us upset with each other, that causes divisions, and maybe even creates rivalries as we form our own little faction against that person and their little faction. This is not acceptable. Remember who the enemy is, and the enemy is not the person sitting around you in this room. So this week, even before we get to the place where we talk about prayer as one of our weapons, I'm calling you to do battle by prayer. A battle for the strength, for the protection, for the unity of the pastoral leadership and the church called Evergreen. And when something happens and you are tempted to go, I hate that guy. You say, wait a minute. See, the enemy, he doesn't show up and come at you with a full frontal assault. You know what he does? He hides in the bushes and he throws pebbles at you. And he does it over and over and over again until he finally hits you with that pebble that just puts you over the line. You're like, enough! And you just go off on somebody. You ever yell at somebody about something incredibly minor, but you were really upset about 12 things before that didn't have anything to do with that person? They just happened to be there when the explosion went off. Folks, that is spiritual warfare. There's an enemy, and he's throwing pebbles at you until you go off. Eyes of faith, spiritual eyes, see the spiritual realities behind the normal, mundane things that happen in our day. And it guides us to be made strong in the Lord as we respond to those mundane realities like Jesus would. You don't think Jesus ever had the opportunity to be upset with somebody, to be irritated, to go off on somebody, and yet he didn't. Why? Because he recognized that the person that was rubbing him the wrong way, that flesh and blood person, that's never the battle. There's somebody behind that's the enemy. And so I'm calling you. I'm calling you to war. We'll learn more about our weaponry, our armor. But it is not too early for us to begin to say, Lord, make me strong. Give me eyes to see spiritual realities behind the flesh and blood circumstances of my everyday life. And protect the relationships of a family called Evergreen. And especially, Lord, protect the leaders that are the targets of the enemy in a particular way. You say, I've never thought about prayer as a weapon of spiritual warfare. Okay. Now you will. And you are already more prepared to advance the kingdom of Christ than you were yesterday. So let's let this series on spiritual warfare take us through what is essentially a training manual of how to be warriors, a part of an unassailable army, so that we do warfare until every last square inch of creation is once again brought under the righteous reign and rule of the one who sits on the throne. That is why we're here. We are the army of the Lord of armies, God omnipotent, Jesus Christ, the King. I'm not going to call you to an invitation today. I am going to ask you that right where you're sitting, you make a decision to find time to pray in the ways that I've talked about today. Let this, if you're struggling to have a regular quiet time, if you're having trouble reading your Bible every day, let this be a call to arms. Open up your Bible. Say, man, I just don't have time. Listen, if you don't have time to do the most important thing, clearly you're doing something that's unimportant. Figure out what it is and chunk it. Take a block of time that you can spend with the Word of God, in the presence of God, praying in the Spirit of God for your church, your family, your pastoral leaders, your city, your nation, your generation. I don't know how you're gifted. I don't know what your calling is, but I know this. Every one of us is meant to do battle in prayer every day. Let that begin today, because I'm telling you, what is unfolding in the days ahead will just make this moment that much more significant. Set yourself to become a prayer warrior. That doesn't mean somebody who prays 8 hours a day. It means somebody who prays with a warfare mindset. Do battle each day this week for the cause of Christ.